I'm going to talk about the breeding ecology of Ankmophorus grebes at Clear Lake, California, during a 10-year period from the breeding seasons of 2010 through 2019. This is probably the best bird photo I ever took. I'm rather proud of that one. Okay, first I'll begin with a little brief history about the grebe populations on Clear Lake. Clear Lake is a very altered environment. In 1949, 1953, and 1957, the pesticide DDT was sprayed to control the Clear Lake gnat. Personally, I don't remember ever seeing the Clear Lake gnat up there because there's not that many of them nowadays, but they apparently used to be hordes of them that would get into people's homes. They were attracted to lights at nighttime. And there were subsequent mass mortalities of the grebes that were documented, but I don't think it was more than a few hundred birds that were documented. So they sprayed the lake on 3 separate occasions, massive amounts, and didn't realize what kind of problems it could result in. They quit doing it because after a few years, the insects would resurge again. So they started doing some research on this after the 3rd one, and they discovered that there were elevated concentrations of DDT that were documented in the tissues of fishes and especially grebes. This is a process known as biomagnification. And this was the first well-documented case of it, and it was highlighted in Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. Clear Lake, here in Northern California. During 1962 to 1975, they used the pesticide methylparathion annually, sprayed on the lake to control the Clear Lake gnat. And it was less toxic and less persistent than the DDT, and nobody really did any studies on its effect on birds. Other than to say that it didn't seem to have any effects. And then Clear Lake is greatly contaminated with mercury from the Sulphur Bank mercury mine, which was actively mined from the period of 1872 up through 1957. There have been toxicological studies in the 1980s and 1990s, and more recently in the last 5 or 6 years on the impact of mercury on the birds, and they still find them in the feathers and in the blood, but they've never really studied and documented the impact on the breeding biology of the grebes. A lot of different species of fish were introduced into Clear Lake. In 1967, the Mississippi silverside basically took over the lake within a year or two. Its biomass was greater than any of the native species and introduced species combined. So massive numbers of Mississippi silversides, which were small minnow-like fish. And in 1980 fish, the threadfin shad was not introduced by government biologists. It somehow got there, and its numbers immediately boomed as well. And these 2 fish seem to have had an impact on populations of grebes, which I'll talk about later. So before 1949, before the first mass application of DDT on Clear Lake, there was a ornithologist named Miller who actually had a home up there, and he estimated that there were at least 1,000 pairs of grebes. We can expect to see maybe 1,000 nests in a breeding season, and that's the only reference to a large size of grebes. There were some previous publications that mentioned many grebes, or counting 100 nests or something like that from back in the 1920s or 30s. Immediately after the 1957 season, the 57 spring, they began monitoring the grebes. And during the first 2 years, in 1958 and 1959, they could not find a single nest on the lake. In 1960, they found 1 chick, so there must have been at least 1 nest somewhere on the lake. By 1961, they counted 36 nests. By 1967, 165. The most they could count in 1973 was 49. There were other counts in between those years, but they weren't as high. And then a more consistent survey from 1992 to 1995 revealed up to 390 nests. And the first time they recorded more than 1,000 nests in the season was in 2000, when they counted 2,675 nests. And subsequent studies up through 2009, I mean, they did counts every year from the University of California, Davis. That was the maximum number they found up through that period. So we came along in 2010, and Gary Langham is the second from left there. He wrote the proposal for Audubon, California. And because I happen to be the nearest ornithologist that living near Clear Lake, I was invited and contracted by the Redbud Audubon Society to participate in this project in which 4 different Audubon societies had gotten funding to study the grebes in their respective territories. So this is a canoe. I went and bought a canoe, and I have subsequently canoed about 1,500 miles perhaps on the lake. I haven't really tried to count it. It's kind of a rough estimate. It could be very tiring. The students were very excited to work with me. I had lots of students working with me. These 2 guys slept all the time. Yeah, they slept a lot. But it was a long drive to get to the lake. And so I had a lot of different students work with me. That happens to be me. We discovered that when you paddle slowly, you can get very close to the grebes without them leaving the nest. And these are just a number of different students that you can see here who helped me with the project. And I'll just go through these real quickly. So over 10 years, I had quite a few different students work with me. This is my wife and our little dog who passed away last year, and another photo of me and my wife. That's my wife and my son. My wife happens to be from Paraguay, where I spent a lot of time as a Peace Corps volunteer there. More students and more students and another student and another student. This was a local birder who often joined me when no student can join me. And he actually wound up working more hours than anybody during the 10-year period. Brian McIntosh is his name. He was a good worker. This is a couple that lives up there, Brad and Kathy, Brad Barnwell, sometimes helped out. And this was a local news reporter, Terry Knight, and he would give me tips on where he saw grebes nesting. So basically, we would go out in the canoe and we would search for nests. That was the main thing we did. And then during a 4-year period, we would set up cameras. And we would set up a certain number of cameras out there to document activities occurring at the nest. We initially did that because we wanted to document the fate of the eggs and what kind of animals were preying upon them, and whether humans were disturbing the nests and that sort of a thing. So if you're not familiar with these grebes, and I assume you are, but just in case you're not, there's 2 species that are very similar, the western grebe and the Clark's grebe. The western grebe, you can distinguish by having a more greenish yellow bill. I put yellow there, it looks kind of greenish in that photo. And the Clark's grebe has usually a brighter orange bill. During the wintertime, it may not be so bright. And also you can see that in the western grebe, the black extends below the eye, and in the Clark's grebe, the black is above the eye. So the Clark's grebe is whiter on the face, and it's kind of a prettier bird, a little bit more colorful, although they're not the most colorful birds. They do hybridize. I have a lot of data on that, and I haven't quite finished the manuscript. I haven't really analyzed the data yet, and that's coming up soon. But here you can see a male western grebe on top of a female Clark's grebe. Notice the difference in bill size. That has nothing to do with the species. It has to do with the sex. Bills generally have a much more massive bill than the female. And it's quite distinctive. When you see these birds a lot, you can get fairly good at identifying them, but sometimes they're a bit tricky. So here's a mixed pair with a grebe. And here's a bird, I'm not sure which that is. Okay, he's got the bright orange bill of a Clark's grebe, but he's got a little bit of black coming down underneath the eye. So I would guess that is a hybrid bird. And the Clark's grebes actually pair with the western grebe about 1/3 of the time. Now, about 85% of the grebes on the lake are western grebes, and about 15% are Clark's grebes. So if a Clark's grebe was randomly meeting with any grebe, it would pick a western grebe about 85% of the time, but they only pick them about 1/3 of the time. I'm not sure what the exact numbers are because I haven't analyzed the data yet. And that indicates that the Clark's grebes prefer to mate with their own species. And it's difficult to get that kind of data for the western, because when you're looking at a colony, your eyes kind of fixate on the different looking ones that are there. And it's harder to get the unbiased count from western grebes mating with Clark's grebes. So that's why scientists consider them to be separate species, because they prefer to mate with their own kind, even though they do hybridize a lot. And these grebes have elaborate courtship displays if you've never seen them before. I do have a video. If you were to do I got a 13-minute video on the Grebes at Clear Lake that you could easily find. This is called a weed ceremony. So if you did a Google video search, you'd find it on YouTube, the Grebes of Clear Lake, in which I describe a lot of this, but it's now an old video. I made it some years ago. So they dance across the water, and they're pretty spectacular birds. And, we focused on their breeding biology. They build two kinds of nests. The first kind is what we call a marsh nest, in which they attach their floating nest to emergent aquatic vegetation, usually pretty close to shore and shallow water. And here are some examples. They'll have entire colonies that are built in marshes attached to emergent, which means they're plants sticking above the water. And then they also construct open water nests that are attached to submergent vegetation that is underneath the surface. You don't see the vegetation there, but it's attached to vegetation underneath. And here is a large colony at Clear Lake. And if you really wanted to, you could go there and visit these colonies on Clear Lake. They're pretty exciting to watch. Here's another view of a large colony. Some birds will nest as far as almost 1 kilometer from shore. I think it's about, we estimated it was about 950 meters from shore. And that's the nearest shore back there. And we're not certain how deep the water is. We know it could be more than 3 meters deep, but I had a measuring pole and it wouldn't reach to the bottom. So I'm not sure exactly how deep the deepest ones are. Sometimes they'll build nests on weird structures, such as a floating board or a buoy. They did not complete this nest, but they're obviously starting to build a nest by this buoy. The birds, the grebes, copulate only on the floating nest. And after copulating with the female, the male tenderly stomps on the head of the female and belly flops into the water. It's quite comical to watch, and you got to feel sorry a little bit for the female there, but that's what they do. And sometimes it's a bit electrifying. You have one pair that's copulating, and all of a sudden others, when they see that one copulating, they start doing the same thing too. And they're very excited about colonial breeding, although sometimes you get 1 or 2 nests in a very, very tiny colony. So one of the first, actually the first research paper we published was a study of their copulation behavior, and I'll just go over some of what we found in a moment here. So we managed to get 435 photos from our Nest cameras, and we identified the sex of both individuals in 235 photos. So normally the male mounts the female in about 92% of the time. As you can see here, the male on top has a larger beak. But reverse mounting occurs, in which the female, for some unknown reason, jumps on the back of the male. And obviously, copulation cannot be successful when that happens. Nobody really knows why they do that, but it's been reported in quite a few different species of birds. So that occurs about 8% of the time. And there's another, that's the actual photo of it. The date is wrong. The first year we did this, well, sometimes we didn't set the date properly. We didn't do this in January. Sometimes on one occasion, we documented simultaneous mounting. We believe it was 2 males on a female. The birds are facing us, so it's kind of hard to tell which is a male and which is a female. That seems to make the most sense, but it's impossible to know for certain. And this was the first report ever in Grebes. I was going through like 14,000 photos on a memory card one night, and it was about 10 o'clock, and it was getting late, and I was getting sleepy. And when I saw that photo right there, I suddenly started laughing. And so that got published. Then we had one instance that we believe was an example of male mounting. Here's one bird mounting another, and just judging from the beak sizes, they look about the same. We're pretty sure those are 2 different males. It's hard to be certain. Male mounting is homosexuality, and that's been reported in many, many species of birds, including several species of grebes. This is a female Clark's grebe who just laid her egg. And early in the breeding season, when they first construct a nest, they're kind of impatient, and the female will start laying eggs, and and they're lost because they're in the water. The nest isn't substantial enough to support the eggs. And both sexes participate in building the nests and incubating as well. When a potential threat approaches, they often cover up the eggs before they leave the nest, as you can see in this photo here. Early in the season, they tend to abandon the nest if you get too close, so you got to be careful not to get too close. But later in the season, they could be very fierce at defending their nest. They'll bite you if you give them a chance. The only time I ever got bitten, I was taking a video of a grebe that was swimming underwater near its nest, and it suddenly jabbed my finger and drew blood from my finger. It really hurt, and I was afraid I was going to die of some nasty bacterium from the water of Clear Lake. If you've been to Clear Lake, if you've been to Clear Lake before, you know it's not clear. And so yeah, they could be very defensive of their nests, and which is good, but they tend to be more defensive later once the chicks the eggs have been there for like a week or two. It takes about 23 days for the eggs to incubate before they hatch. And the longer time they spend and invest on their nest, the more defensive they are of them. We generally just would slowly paddle toward the birds, and as soon as we saw a bird jump off the nest, we'd stop. And then if you just wait there, the birds would jump back on the nest, and then you could slowly paddle a little bit closer. And we usually kept our distance from a colony, but there were some huge colonies. The only way to count them is you have to go right through the middle of it and count. One person counts on one side of the colony and one person on the other. And so we typically visited a colony about once a week. We discovered that nocturnal courtship occurred. Of about 75 rushing displays that we got photos of them, a little more than 19% of them occurred at nighttime. We also got photos of 2 weed dancing displays at night. Nobody knew this went on. Here's a nocturnal rush display. It's a slow shutter speed, so I assume there's 2 birds instead of 3 there that are rushing. There could be 3 though, sometimes they have 3. And you can see them rushing behind the bird on its nest. And they also copulate at night. When a student first showed me this, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And then the next year we had a lot of data. So we had 435 copulations, about 8.4% of them occurred at nighttime. And here's another image of them at nighttime. And here's a graph showing how from midnight at 0 to midnight at 24, the peak copulation activity occurred early in the morning. They tended to take a bit of a break at midday, and then in the afternoon they kind of picked up just a little bit, and they kind of tailed off later in the afternoon. But yeah, middle of the night, especially early in the morning before dawn, sometimes they would copulate. They even laid eggs at night. We had 4 egg-laying incidents occurring at nighttime. That's one. And here you can see an example. There's nothing on this nest. And 51 minutes and 34 seconds, lo and behold, there's an egg. We also published a paper. This one was in Western Birds on egg destruction by males, which is a real surprise. First time I realized what was going on, I was trying to find out what happened to the eggs, and I'm just going through the slides. I'm seeing 2 eggs, 2 eggs, 2 eggs, 2 eggs, and all of a sudden there's only 1 egg. And I'm like, well, what happened? So I backed up to see what happened. And we wound up photographing 6 incidents of egg destruction in 11,309 camera hours. So we had a lot of cameras out there for 4 different summers. One incident was observed by a student in 282.7 hours of observation. So here you can see, well, here's another photo. Here you can see a Clark's Grebe that looks like it's, it may be moving the egg, it may be whatever, but it apparently picked up the egg, and here it is 2.8 minutes later. There's only 1 egg there. And this was another egg that was laid 1.35 hours later, so suddenly a 2nd egg appeared, and then 6.7 minutes later, whoops, there it is with a hole in it in the water. So we recorded several examples of that in both species of birds, and it's really strange behavior. We're not certain why they do it. In every instance, it was a male, and it was always late in the breeding season. One thing that happens is when predators come in and they eat the eggs, these nests take a lot of time to build and maintain. They have to maintain them every day. And so whenever there's an empty nest available, we'd often get grebes that hop on top of them and copulate, and sometimes they lay eggs on those nests, and then they abandon the nest. So they don't seem to be very serious about mating when this occurs. And you know, it could be that the male thought his mate had mated with somebody else and it was somebody else's egg. These are unbanded birds, so we don't know exactly who each bird is and who mated with who. So we can only speculate as to why they do it, but it's kind of weird. Communal egg dumping is very common. We've had up to 30 eggs dumped in a nest. So these birds are prolific. Females are producing lots of eggs. And it is thought that it could result in hybridization when a chick, for example, of a Clark's grebe, if the eggs are laid in the nest of a Western grebe, and then the chick hatches and it's raised by the Western grebe, perhaps the Clark's grebe chick is going to imprint on the Western grebe, and when it becomes an adult, it's going to mate with a Western grebe instead of a Clark's grebe. Now, nobody knows for certain if that's true, but it's been suggested that may be one reason why they hybridize so frequently. So here's a photo of 11 eggs. That's a juvenile California gull. We don't know why it's there. I thought maybe that the gull tried to prey on the eggs and a grebe speared it from underneath, but I didn't think of that at the time. I didn't examine the body of the gull. Here are 14 eggs in a single nest. And here are 30 eggs in a single nest. So when there's so many eggs, we know they're not all going to hatch. So we would take them home and we would fry them and create omelets. And they tasted pretty good, except they had a slight taste of mercury. I'm just joking, of course. We never ate an egg. We wouldn't dare eat them. We also discovered that these grebes are ecosystem engineers. And we discovered that their floating nests provide resources for wildlife. And so we published a research paper on that, and I'll go over some of the results. So they often used each other's nests for copulation and egg dumping, but there were 47 other species of vertebrates that used the grebe nests for 6 distinct ecological roles, which nobody had really studied before. So we discovered one other species of bird besides Western and Clark's grebes that was egg dumping. And we believe these eggs are of a pied-bill grebe, the smaller ones there. There's no other real good candidates. And here is a chick, a definite chick of a pied-bill grebe. And as you can see, there's some actual eggs underneath it. This is in the middle, in a big nest. You could actually distinguish a pied-bill grebe nest. They tend to have a lot more mud on them and less coarse, more fine material than what the Ecmophorus grebes have. Ecmophorus is the genus. Predation occurred by 4 birds and 3 mammals. The American crow was the biggest predator during the day. And California gulls were often in colonies, but they very rarely preyed on the eggs. I'm not sure why. It may not have been all that useful for them. This is a ring-billed gull that's actually flying off with a chick. This is the beak of the chick, the 2 eyes right there. I'm using my cursor here. And you can see, I think the leg, and I think that's one leg and that's another, I think. But we only had a couple incidents of ring-billed gulls preying on the nest. There aren't large numbers of them in August and September. The American mink, we had several incidents of them preying on eggs. This is the only time we had a mammal during the day preying on eggs. And northern raccoon preyed on eggs. There's some unidentified predator of adults. We saw a number of adults in which the head and neck would be eaten, and we're not sure what was eating them. We never did get a photo of whatever it was that was eating them, but they would often just ignore the eggs. And that looks like it got squashed by some animal that was feeding on this. So I think it's a mammal, but I'm not real certain. It could be an owl, but I'm guessing it's a nocturnal mammal that somehow managed to catch an adult. For some reason, all they would eat was the head and neck. I would think the flight muscles, might be more nutritious. I don't know. At least 5 species of birds were scavenging. For example, here's a red-winged blackbird that was scavenging on eggs that had been preyed upon by probably a raccoon. The nests are often used for resting, at least 1 amphibian, 3 reptiles, and 15 birds. Here's an American bullfrog just basking on a nest. Western pond turtle, a lot of ducks, mallard, for example. And these aren't mallard's eggs, these are grebe eggs. A lot of these eggs are abandoned. Here's American white pelicans, Bonaparte gull, just a few examples. Foraging for other prey on nests. We had long-billed dowitchers foraging for little arthropods, and yellow-headed blackbird foraging on arthropods in the nest, usually in the late stages of the breeding cycle. Foraging for other prey in the water, 5 species. Here's a green heron, actually looks like he's catching something. This is with a Nest camera, took that photo. And here's a great blue heron that's standing on the nest, and it's a great platform for, and there may even be fish that are attracted to the nest. Nobody studied that. So it may be a great place for these fishing birds to search for fish. Hatching and development of the grebes. Here's a grebe egg hatching. And here's a recently hatched egg. As soon as they hatch, the birds actually climb up onto the backs of the parents. And as soon as the last egg hatches, or even before, sometimes they'll abandon the last egg or two and just swim off with a bunch of chicks on their back. So here's a chick on the back of an adult, looks like a female, and she's probably still sitting on a few eggs. And here are 2 chicks on the back and 1 swimming in the water. Hard to get close to these birds to get good photos. I've seen as many as 5 chicks on the back in photos taken by friends. So we mapped out the nesting areas each summer, and I'm just going to go through these quickly, but you can get an idea of the geography of Clear Lake and where these birds are nesting. And then I'm going to summarize it in a moment. But each year we mapped out where the colonies were and how many nests there were in each colony and when they began nest construction and the first egg and first chick and all of that. And it gets a little boring. We're getting into a little bit of science here. But I want to point out that these are where the most important grebe colonies are on Clear Lake. So if you're interested in going there, I would recommend going to the north end of the lake, northwest end of the lake here. We averaged over 1,000 nests a year at the northwest end of Clear Lake. And then in these channels, the tributaries up here, they're favored by nesting, as well as in the outlet of Clear Lake. So this is called Rodman Slough, and this is Cache Creek that comes out through here, and it flows through an area called Anderson Marsh, if you've never been there before. Now, the only way you can really see these birds well generally is to go out there in a canoe or a kayak. It's difficult in a motorboat because these birds are in shallow water and it's often very weedy, and your propeller's going to get tangled up in the weeds. There's also a lot of nesting that occurs in the southwest shore of the upper arm here. This is the Lakeport area here, and Kelseyville over here. Clear Lake State Park is right in this area. So I'm going to talk about reproductive success a lot. Here's a graph illustrating the number of nests per year. And if you look at that, this is called a Spearman-Rank correlation coefficient. This is the probability that there is no correlation. And anytime this number here is greater than 0.05, it means that there's no trend at all. If this number is less than 0.05, there is a trend. So we're not really seeing a trend. The number of nests per year is highly variable, although it's higher than it used to be, up to nearly 6,000 nests. So the grebes have gone on a journey from pesticide poisoning to reproductive recovery. Remember that it was thought that there were only about 1,000 pairs nesting prior to 1949, maybe more than 1,000, but just one estimate. The maximum number of nests up through 2009 was 2,065. From 2010 to 2019, we recorded 5,936 at the most in one breeding season. So in conclusion, it is possible, we can't be certain, there may be more breeding grebes on Clear Lake than ever. And one possibility is that there's more fish biomass. And the reason why is because with these introduced fish, especially the Mississippi silverside, which I mentioned, it's competing with the larvae of the Clear Lake gnat. The larvae of the gnat are, there's like billions of them in Clear Lake, and they live in the bottom of Clear Lake. And so they feed on plankton in the water, and when they emerge, they export a lot of biomass into a terrestrial environment. But if these fish are competing with the gnats, then there seem to be much fewer gnats now than there were, because they're not even trying to spray the lake anymore. It could be because there's more fish biomass that stays in there that provides more food for the grebes. So introducing species of fish to different areas is not really good for ecology in general. They're competing with the native species of fish. Some of them have gone extinct or gone endangered. However, this seems to be one instance in which the grebes may well have benefited, as well as other fish-eating birds like cormorants and herons. The water level was highly variable. Typically, this is the month of January, February, March. Typically, during the winter, the lake would fill up with water, and then during the spring, it would gradually decline when it would stop raining until the fall. Then you get more rain in the fall. The lowest water level was in the year 2014, which you can see down here. And the highest level was in 2019, which I think was actually 2017. Well, one of these years, I can't remember which. This is just a graph of seasonal variation, the number of new nests. These guys are late breeders. They normally don't start breeding until the middle of June. But a few years they nest earlier. Notice that in 2017, we had a bunch of nests at the end of April. This is the month of April here, May, June. So we had a bunch of nests at the end of May and a couple thousand of them end of April, a couple thousand by the beginning of May, as well as a chick. And just dating back to 23 days of incubation, we know that the earliest egg had to be laid by at least April 14. So we don't really know why. Some years they breed early, but usually don't breed until the middle of June. They don't start nesting until then. We've seen birds sitting on eggs as late as October 3. If we look at we thought maybe water level affected the number of nests. And here are the data. This is number of nests on the, what we call this the y-axis here, and then water level down here. And you can see that there's not much of a correlation. The highest number of nests occurred during the year with the lowest water, and the lowest number of nests occurred during the year with the second lowest water level. And the other years were somewhere in between. So you can't really conclude that water level affects the number of nests. We looked at the percent of the nests actually on Clear Lake versus in the tributary at the north end of the lake and the outlet at the south end of the lake. So we discovered that there was a pretty strong correlation. This value is less than 0.01. So there's more nests in the tributaries and outlet and fewer nests on Clear Lake itself when the water level is high. So here's high water level, you get more nests. You get fewer nests on the lake and more nests that are in the tributaries and the outlet. And that has some implications because when the nests are built out in open water, they easily get disturbed by humans and boats and by high winds when the water level is low. So this is an argument that it's probably better for the grebes when the water level is high, because then they get to nest inside the marshes in the tributary and the outlet of the lake, rather than being more exposed out in the deeper water in the lake. So here's an example of the water level when it was lowest in 2014. As you can see, almost all the nests were out in the lake. And there are only like 56 plus one nest that were in the tributary here. So almost all the grebes were nesting out in the lake that year. And then in 2017, when water level was highest, there were very few nests in the lake. Most of the birds were in the tributaries up here of the lake. They were nesting up in here. Very few in the lake itself and in the outlet of the lake. With none of them, oh wait, this year when there were water level was really low, there was nothing nesting down in this end of the lake. The water level was just too low in these areas for the birds to nest. So we think that the lake having a lot of water is good for the grebes. They get to nest in the marshes and they're safer from humans and from wind events. We looked at nest type. The open water nests are far from shore, and they are most frequent when the water level is low, and they're mostly marsh nests when the water level is high. So more open water nests when the water level is low, more marsh nests when the water level is high. And we think that's good for the birds when the water level is high. There's also less destruction by wind when the water level is high. Here's an example of more marsh nests when the water level is high. Then you get more open water nests when the water level is low and the birds can't nest in the marshes because they're dry. Talk about natural threats. Wind is a major problem. And we had a major event that happened during August 2014 in which about 1,000 nests, I kid you not, were destroyed during a 4-day period. That was our estimate based on the number of nests that were out there floating in the water before the windstorm and after the windstorm. 1,000 nests with approximately 4,000 eggs. It's just a wild estimate. And here you could see photos of the nests in which you could see the nests just floating, being blown towards shore by the wind. Just watch these nests getting closer and closer to shore. Some people didn't believe that these nests could be blown by the wind. Here's your proof right here. So destruction by wind is a major cause of mortality. This was another event in which we had about 200 nests here, and then 3 days later I returned and most of these nests had blown ashore and most of them were abandoned. You can see all these little white things. Those are eggs, mostly eggs out there, and a few birds. So wind is not good for these birds, and this happens throughout the range. There have been other reports in the literature. So if we look at another conclusion is that there's more predation by mammals when the water level is high. And and this is significant here. Also looks like the relationship is curvilinear. So when the water level is high and the birds are nesting in the marshes, they're very accessible to raccoons and minks. We had 1 predation per 165 camera hours. And when the water was low, the mammals had to swim farther out into the lake in order to prey on the eggs. And there was only 1 predation per 514 camera hours. So here you could see 1 out of 165 hours and 1 out of 514 camera hours. So the high water is actually good for the birds to avoid mammal predation. But we think they get more bird predation in the open water nests because they're easier for birds to find. So it's a mixed bag. If we look at the reproductive success of the birds, this is a comparison of the number of juveniles versus water level. I think our highest count of juveniles was like 598 or 599. And there's not much of a relationship there. It doesn't seem to be affected by water level, which was kind of disappointing because we thought they would be more successful at reproducing when the water level was low and the birds were less disturbed by humans and by wind. Another measurement of reproductive success is the juvenile to adult ratio. And again, we really didn't find a relationship with water level, so that did not seem to be a factor. The graphs here are rather similar if you look at them. Just a couple different measures of reproductive success. So just going through some of the predators here is the raccoon's the #1 predator at nighttime. And we got, I think we had 53, something like that, incidents of raccoon predation. Only about, I think, 2 or 3 incidents of minks. Here's a mink at nighttime. You can see his body there, and here's a mink during the daytime. They're about half the size of a otter. They got a more pointed snout. The tail's a little differently. Now, the northern river otter, you would think, they're very common there. You would think they would be major predators, but strangely enough, they aren't. Whenever they would go into a colony, the grebes would flee instantly. And we saw this happen a lot, but the otters almost invariably ignored the nests. One time I actually could hear them crunching on eggs. And then we later found the nest that had like 4 smashed up eggs in it that these otters were feeding on, but I didn't actually observe it directly. And then we had one instance in which otter came to a nest that had 1 egg on it, and then it swam away from it. I think it actually climbed up in the nest, and then it just swam away, which is very strange. So the otters, for some reason, don't seem very interested in the eggs of the otters, of the grebes. Now, maybe they killed the adult grebes. That could well be. They are known to kill adult birds. And again, here's, you know, one of the adult birds that we'd find on the nest, and we're not sure what's killing them, and nobody knows. That's still a mystery. Here's some American crows nesting. They're the #1 predator during the day. More American crows. These are the eggs left behind. I was astonished the first time I saw a crow flying with a grebe egg, because these grebe eggs are very similar in size to a chicken egg. And I just could not imagine a crow fitting one of those in its beak, but I saw this happen on numerous occasions. Here's a crow that landed on this pier, this piling here, and I watched it as it was eating that egg. And then there was a beach there, a little sandy beach, and I went and counted. Over a week, the number of eggs kept on increasing, and eventually I counted something like 101 eggs on this beach. So the crows were flying to the beach and then eating the eggs there. Pretty amazing. So predation by crows is pretty substantial. We never really witnessed it much inside the marshes, but you can't really see the birds going into the nest very easily because they're just hard to observe when they're hidden in the marshes. Oh yeah, here's a egg eaten by a crow. California gulls, seldom eat them. Nest eaten by gulls, and again a ring-billed gull. I'm not sure if I have this twice, but I do here. Yeah, here's a chick being eaten, swallowed. We do see dead chicks sometimes. We're not sure why they die. There are some human threats. The birds don't seem to be too concerned about humans, to be honest. This is a colony that you could see here built right in front of homes built along the shore. And the birds just kind of usually ignore humans unless you get a little bit too close, and then they swim away. They dive underwater to escape. You know, fishermen are out there going back and forth. There's a lot of kayakers. This guy came up to the camera, but he didn't disturb the camera. We did have one camera that got stolen, but it wasn't by him, as far as we know. So one potential problem is that boaters often go too fast near colonies. You can see some nests here, and they generate large waves, which can be a problem. Here's a jet ski going right toward a colony. These are all photos I took, by the way. But the grebe colonies aren't disturbed a whole lot by boats, and the reason why is you can see here, because when these boats go into the grebe colonies, the propellers get tangled up with weeds, and so the weeds are the friend of the grebes. That's where they like to nest, and so there's not a whole lot of conflict between the grebes and the boaters. The predecessors of our grant, the University of California at Davis, there's a professor there, William Anderson, who actually had some master students. They had the grant 5 years before it was then awarded to Audubon, California. And they set up some signs, but the signs could be hard to find. There's a little sign over here, but if you're in a boat, you're probably going to go through this bigger channel here than over here. And here's what the sign looks like. It's kind of hard to read it. The water level went up above it, and the sign's pretty dirty. These are some of the waves that you could see, and waves potentially cause a problem. The nests move up and down really well in the waves from boats. Wind seems to be much more of a problem, though, than boats. However, this was a nest that had a boat go past it really fast, and I watched the nest actually roll over, and there's an egg that somehow got tangled up in the weeds there. We actually go out there, and we'd help set up some buoys, warning boaters to slow down when they're in the proximity of grebe colonies. And we also have a sign that's posted on this bridge that crosses Rodman Slough. When you go up Rodman Slough, which is one of the tributaries, the largest tributary, it's warning boaters not to go too fast. Now, I didn't put up this sign. We had other aspects of the grant that went to other people that were working on this sort of thing. There are often planes in the area, and we don't know what kind of an impact they have. But the fishermen basically coexist pretty well with the grebes on the lake, although there are some issues such as birds that get tangled up in fishing line. Here's a bird that got probably strangled and drowned, entangled in fishing line. And I got a whole bunch of data on I think I may have over 50, 40 some different birds on Clear Lake that have been entangled in fishing gear. And I think more than a third of them are grebes. Grebes are very vulnerable to get entangled in fishing gear because fishermen catch them and they'll cut the line, or they'll catch something else and the line, or they throw away the line and it gets stuck there and birds get tangled in it, which is a hazard for wildlife. Here's another grebe that was killed by a fishing line. I believe this grebe had a hook in its mouth. We tried to catch it and he was swimming away from us, but not once did he ever look down. I think he had a hook in his mouth and it hurt less when he looked upward. That's my guess. I don't know why else he was looking upward. Why would a grebe be staring up at the sun all day long? We're concerned about some invasive weeds. The government, millions of dollars of our taxes have been spent trying to keep invasive weeds, especially hydrilla, the one on the left, out of Clear Lake. And it's there. They have to spray it with herbicides to kill it. So I think that's Eurasian water milfoil right here rather than hydrilla. But there's a lot of weeds there, and this is a crew that actually goes out every summer and they spray the weeds to try to manage them. And they also go in these airboats, and they're trained to stay away from the grebe colonies, although sometimes we've caught them going through colonies. But when they spray the weeds, they kill the weeds, and sometimes the grebes are actually nesting in areas where they sprayed, or they go afterwards, and that the herbicides that they use on these weeds can't be good for the birds, although nobody's really studied that in much detail. Here's a machine that was actually pulling the weeds out of the water that they used one summer. They decided to quit using it because it was breaking apart the weeds and they thought it was spreading the weeds even more. And then there's a certain species of mussel called a quagga, as well as the zebra mussel, that they're spending millions of dollars trying to keep out of Clear Lake. And this is a grave threat to Clear Lake because of these mussels, which are mollusks, shells. If they get into Clear Lake, they are filter feeders. And they're going to filter out all the plankton in the water that the fish eat. And if there's fewer fish in the lake, there's going to be fewer fish-eating birds. So this is a grave threat to the ecosystem, natural ecosystem of Clear Lake. And how many more years can we keep these mussels out? They're getting into more and more lakes here in California, and they cause problems. I have not been in charge of the public education program, but we have a bunch of signs. These are signs that are posted around the lake, and I got a photo of one I need to add to this, but really nice lakes. Our signs don't say Oroville Wildlife Area. They were initially designed by people in the Plumas Audubon Society. No, actually it was Altacal Audubon Society. Oroville's no Altacal. This is a political rally. I won't say which party it was, but this is Marilyn Waits, who is the president of the society for many years, and she actually managed the project. I just did the research on the birds and monitoring. Here's a little decoy for education. You can see here, this is a container for fishing line. So we're trying to get fishermen to dispose of their fishing line in these containers rather than just leaving them out there beside the lake. We've helped put up buoys. And then for 2 different summers, we managed to set up a webcam in the balcony of homes that happened to be near some nests. And here you can see the webcam pointed toward the nest. And this is our team that set up the first one. And we were able to stream the activities at these nests live for a short period of time. This one only lasted a few days the first time. On the second time, I believe it lasted for a week. And this is a photo I took. This is a screenshot from my computer here in my office, which was kind of fun. So we live streamed this for about a week. And this is the house we did it at the second time. Really nice house. The owners let us set it up. And here's our team here, focusing on the nest out there. A really good live webcam. Unfortunately, we only had 2 summers in which they nested close enough to homes that we could do that. And that is the end of my presentation. So I guess if you have any, and this is a photo of, that's actually the moon. And this is when the sky was at sunset and there'd been a fire nearby and it was kind of a smoky day. So you see the pink in the sky and in the water. So if you have any, I believe that I'm going to go ahead and see if I can figure out how to, here we go. Stop share. So if you guys have any questions?
Actually, Floyd, do you have access to chat down there at the bottom?
Chat, I do. Did somebody ask some questions?
Yeah, that's so they're posting.
Oh, good. Oh, good. I see that, Mark. Is that you?
That's mainly me, yes.
Did the nest float around or were they secured? That's a very good question because we would aim in the open water nests that we pointed the cameras at. Those nests would just float around and just kind of go in and out of the view of the camera, which made it difficult to calculate how many hours we were observing the nest. Yeah, they would float around. When the wind blows them, the problem is that they would break off from the submergent vegetation, and then they would float to shore. How does the nest stay afloat? Well, apparently those weeds float. The nests start out rather green and they become increasingly brown as they age. And then they get colonized by more and more arthropods. I'd love to get somebody in there to do some sampling of the arthropods that are breaking down the nests later during the breeding season. As the nests get older and older, they disintegrate. Yeah. Up to 30 eggs in a nest. Does a grebe actually sit on all these eggs? That's a very good question. I'm going to work on a research paper on that. I haven't analyzed the data, but there are a lot of, I'm guessing I probably had about 30 nests that had 10 or more eggs. Normally the grebes would incubate up to 10 eggs. Anything more than 10, I only on one occasion saw grebes that were nesting on a nest that had 18 eggs. 18 eggs, and the birds were incubating them. So we set up a camera to document what was going on. And when we came back the next week, we barely got in there because the water had gone down and we had to climb, we had to go through trees, duck under trees. It was hard getting the canoe to go in there. It was way up in Rodman Slough. And then to our dismay, we discovered that the batteries had died within an hour of putting up the cameras. So we don't know what happened to that nest, but it had 18 eggs and we saw an adult incubating on it. Yeah. So that's the most I have seen them incubating, you know. I don't know what it was thinking. I think what happens is that there'll be an empty nest somewhere, and these females, there was apparently a publication in which like decades and decades ago, like almost a century ago, where somebody had I think they had a pied-bill grebe. I don't know if it was a captive bird or it was in a little pond beside their home or office or whatever, but it laid like 50 eggs in one season. So these birds are prolific layers. And I think when they see an empty nest, they just go over and dump eggs in it, hoping that somebody's going to incubate it. Oh. Yeah. That's what I think. Were the fish introduced to control the gnats? That's a good question. No, they weren't. But apparently, they contributed to lowering the population of gnats. Now, I get my information about the gnats from a entomologist that worked in the, I think they called it pest control. What was it? They had a name for it up in Lake County. Lake County, I think it was called Lake County Pest Control. But he spent a lot of time studying them, and he knew the birds very well. And he was the one, I have to give him credit. His name is Dave Woodward. He came up with the idea that the fish were competing with the larvae for plankton, and that's why the larvae of the gnats are no longer as abundant as they used to be. So it was his idea, and I got it from him. And I have a research paper that's accepted for publication. I'm working on on revising, but I'm giving him credit for that idea because I don't want to take credit for it. But as far as I know, there weren't any fish introduced to control gnats. Most of the fish were introduced for fishing, I suppose. I don't know why people just love introducing fish all over the planet. In California, you know, people like to introduce trout to these big mountain lakes, small mountain lakes, where they don't belong, and they wind up eating the tadpoles of frogs and cause a lot of problems. Patty, I understand that the lake is the lowest this year since 1974. I expect that will impact the courtship and breeding of the grebes. I haven't looked at the website for the data. I have no idea what it's like. Our project ran out of money in 2019. We didn't have any funding for 2020, but we couldn't have done any work. We probably couldn't have done much work in 2020 because of the pandemic. So nobody's going to study the birds this year. So you know, the lowest year we had happened to have the most grebe nests. So I don't know if it's going to negatively impact the grebes or not. It might. Oh, another good question by Anne. Have the wildfires impacted the grebes at all? And I do have a potential answer for that. I think it was in 2018. There were some wildfires. I think there were a couple of them that summer, that actually burned all the way down to the lake. There was a massive fire. I think it was at the Mendocino complex, and several fires that joined together. And during that particular year, we had quite a few nests, but we only had one chick that we found we do an annual survey in September in which we go in a boat all the way around the lake, the perimeter of the lake. We found only one chick that year. And later that year, there was another friend of mine that happened to see two of them. But I don't know how she happened to see them, because we saw, you know, thousands of adult grebes, but only one chick. And I suspect that now, right after the fires happened, I went up there, and the smoke was really bad, and I had to wear a mask because it was just so bad to breathe the air. And there were hundreds of nests out there, and the grebes were doing their courtship behavior. They were incubating eggs. They were copulating. They were laying eggs. This was like in the month of August. And this was right after the fires. So I don't think the fires affected their breeding, but I have a suspicion that it may have affected the chicks, because I found several publications, research papers, in which they reported that what happens is these chicks, when they inhale smoke, it may take them a week or 2 or 3 to die. So it weakens their immune systems and weakens their bodies. So I have a feeling that the fires may have reduced the breeding success during that year. My evidence is circumstantial. I don't have proof. But it was a very bad year for birds. And like I said, we found only one chick right after the major fires. Anybody else have questions?
Just, yeah, you talk about the fact that they're lay lots and lots of eggs. How many chicks actually come out of all those eggs, and how many actually get, you know, big enough to fledge and fly? It's got to be a low percentage, but I mean, is it more than 10 or 20% that they actually get to full growth?
That's a good question. We don't really know, but it's a very tiny fraction. It really is. It's a tiny fraction. And for some reason, reproductive success on Clear Lake is much lower than it is on Eagle Lake in northeastern California, and on a lake in Manitoba where they've been studied. And we're not sure why that is. Also, Lake Almanor in northeastern California. But for some reason, Clear Lake has really low reproductive success based on the ratio of juveniles to adults. And I wonder if it has to do with maybe, you know, stressors in the environment like mercury and other pesticides that are getting in the water. I thought it maybe was due to some predatory fish that's been introduced. There is I think the largemouth bass is a predator that's been introduced in Clear Lake, but it's also introduced in these other lakes as well. Furthermore, in those other lakes, I believe they have the pike. I think it's called the northern pike, which also is known to eat baby birds. You have largemouth bass and the pike can eat baby birds. So I don't think that has anything to do with Clear Lake's low reproductive success. I don't really know how to explain it, but it's a tiny fraction of those eggs that actually mature and become adult grebes.
Nope. Any more questions? Anybody have any questions out there? Very interesting talk, Floyd. I enjoyed the pictures and just, the nests floating on water and in thousands. I didn't realize that colonies got that big. It's impressive to see.
I highly recommend having a field trip up there. The best month is probably August, because in August you have a lot of nests and a lot of chicks are hatching at that time. That's pretty much the peak, the first couple weeks in August, and then it starts to trail off.
Yeah. You have to have a canoe to do it to get around?
It's easiest to see them that way. Sometimes there's places you can see them from land, but it's easiest to go out in a boat. You could potentially go out. There's a lady up there that takes tours. Her name is Faith Rigolosi, and she has a business. And so I know she'd be happy if I told you about it. So it's called Eye of the Wild, and she takes people out in a pontoon boat. With a pontoon boat, it's a little bit more difficult to get close to them, but you can see the birds very well from a pontoon boat. You could potentially hire pontoon boats to go out there. I always rent a fishing boat, but there's one vendor, one business in Lakeport that rents boats, and it's called Disney Water Sports. So Disney Water Sports, you could potentially rent a few pontoon boats and take them out if you wanted to have a field trip out there. The Redbud Audubon Society has these field trips in late April or early May, and I assume they'll probably resume next year once we get this pandemic further behind us. But that's a little too early in this breeding season because we don't see them nesting. There was the first year I went out in 2005, they were nesting in late April, and I remember seeing them at that time, but that's very unusual. They usually don't start nesting until June.
Dr. Hayes, I
Yes.
have a question, Roberto. Just a quick one, general one. I'm just curious, some of the stuff that you mentioned about the mussels, I believe, I've heard it from the Solano County Water Agency. That's a big problem at Clear Lake, but my question to you is not, and thank you for covering that too. I'm just curious where that's going with the boaters going in there and bringing more mussels. Anyway, but my question to you is, while you were doing some of this research, were you able to coordinate or were you approached by some of the tribes there, Native American tribes members there, or even so from Solano County Water Agency people, so that they might be curious what you're doing. I don't know if you do that when you're doing your own research. I'm just asking you a curious question here. Curiosity. I'm just curious. What if they take any interest, like you have, about the Grebes and Gibbs and and that's really interesting what's going to them happening.
That's a good. Those are good questions to begin with. As far as I know, there are no mussels in the lake yet. They're trying to keep them out. You could take a canoe in there without an inspection sticker, but if you want to bring your own boat there, you have to get an inspection sticker. I have not had conversations with any of the Native Americans there. Unfortunately, I'm actually married to a lady that's mostly Native American from Paraguay in South America. She even speaks Guarani, which is a Native American language. I would love to have met them, but I never have up there. I never had any conversations with any. I did have frequent conversations with people that worked for Department of Water Resources for Lake County. Because we worked with them, they were actually paid to set up the buoys. So I coordinated with them to put up buoys. We didn't put them up every year because a lot of times the grebes nest in areas where there are already buoys out there and they were pretty well protected. But I worked with them periodically.
I was just curious, if there's any overlap with all this research. I'm sure that scientists like yourself take a lot of interest and hear about other scientists doing all this research in different areas that might be relevant to what you're doing or vice versa, relevant to what they're doing. But I'm just curious if there's um, to get a better picture from and give a better picture to the public, because I don't think the public and I speak as I guess a layperson here. I'm not a scientist like uh, but I take interest in bird life. That's why I joined the Audubon Society, Napa Solano Audubon group, and that I've read for years, and I'm learning a lot from people like yourself, and that's to me enlightening. We're all dealing with our own little area,
Right.
and I'm just speaking as a generalist. And again, I'm speaking also as a librarian, because that's what I've done with my life, and I take a more broader, not a general, but I'm aware that scientists take a very specialized attitude. But I think what I prefer to do is to be more selective, so that we don't lose that knowledge, use it to the best, and then people are getting what is really happening, because we live in a very complicated world with so many people doing so many things all
Right.
the time.
Well, interestingly, the grant initially, now the money actually comes from the MV Lukenbach, which was a oil tanker that sank between San Francisco and the Farallon Islands around like 1953 or something like that. They didn't discover until like 1990 or so where the oil had been leaking up on the beaches, and they didn't discover until then where the oil was coming from. And so they have money set aside for mitigation. And so a certain amount of money went to protect these grebes, and it comes from oil pollution. And the grant initially went to University of California, Davis, and they said they awarded it afterwards to Audubon, California, because they felt at University of California they were doing too much science and not enough education. So they had education people in each of the 4 Audubon societies that went around the different schools and, and gave presentations and so on. So I wasn't really a part of that. I did produce a 13-minute video that's on Yahoo, and they were showing that in the schools. So a lot of the grebes are an iconic fixture of Clear Lake, and you really got to reach the kids there. So they actually had money from this grant to go into the schools and give presentations and teach them about the grebes and how important they are to Clear Lake, which is a really good aspect of the project.
Yeah. And maybe with that knowledge, people will be more responsible when they go there. They don't just bring their boats and, hey, everything's fine, fine and dandy, we're leaving garbage as that's what I'm hearing some of the boaters are doing. Again, I'm not picking it. Again, I'm not against any boater going there, but I'm saying to be aware, you might be, and if you really value that, and I hear a lot of people value Clear Lake, for many, since it's been there, from Native Americans to the present, but it would, being, one thing about knowledge, it changes your consciousness. And the more we know, the more we're more, I think we can be more responsible as to what we're doing and how we're affecting the world. We don't even know sometimes, until it's too late.
Thank
Anyway, that's it.
you, Roberto.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Hey, there was one last question from Adrian on the chat there.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Has there been a study of the water analysis? There's actually been quite a bit of research done on Clear Lake. I don't know if there's been a whole lot of integration and research studies. There's only been a few ornithologists that studied there before I came along. But there have been people studying the water, people studying the fish, people studying the mercury contamination, geologists studying the sediments in the bottom of the lake. There's been people studying the gnat larvae, because that was such a big nuisance. There's a lot of money that went into it. And there's been a lot of studying the water. That actually brings up one issue I remember that I wrote about in my manuscript. Another possibility why reproductive success is so low on Clear Lake that I think may be a factor is the lake goes through periods of anoxic, and they get algal blooms during the summer, and portions of the lake become very anoxic, very low in water. And the grebes actually frequently abandon their colonies. You'll have, 50, 100 grebe nests, and they only last a week, and all of a sudden the birds just abandon them. They got all their eggs there, and the birds just are no longer nesting on them. And I suspect the reason why is that when you have an algal bloom nearby, when the algae die, the bacterial decomposition uses up all the water in the water. The aerobic bacteria use up all the oxygen in the water. And so the fish that live in that area have to, I think schools of fish move elsewhere in the lake. And if the birds have to swim too far to find food, I think they're going to have to abandon their nests. Now, I don't really have any direct evidence that that was the case, but colony abandonment is quite common on the lake, and I actually quantified that. And I think that may be a contributing factor to it.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. It was a very interesting talk, and I think the people who listened to it appreciated it quite
Very
much.
interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Yep. Sounds good.
Nice.
So, have a nice evening, everybody. Thank you for attending, and hopefully we'll see you next month for Mark's talk on pelagic birds.
Okay.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.